This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets. On a year-to-date basis, the JSE Stock 40 is up by over 12% so far this year, effectively recovering some of the losses we saw in the middle of Q3. Sibanye-Stillwater first ran back to the most heavily traded counters on the 28th of October session, moving over 11 million shares apiece. The EGX 30 continues its recovery in the second half of the year, up 1.25% on the last day of its trading week. At these levels, it's within 150 or so points of the year's high. On November 22nd, mark your calendars for this one, the Kenyan Bourse will be formally introducing some day trading. Here's what's coming up tonight. The United Nations sees Sudan at crossroads and in urgent need of the international community's support. We'll have the latest. Ethiopia risks suspension from the US-supported Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And artists in Zimbabwe have found a way of integrating plastic and metal waste into works of art. We'll get into the art a little later in the hour, but first let's start the hour with the latest from Sudan, where the African Union has suspended the nation's participation in all of the bloc's activities due to a coup that took place there. The recent unrest triggered by the military's takeover has caused concern in both the regional and international community. The United Nations has called for calm in the nation and offered to mediate talks between the two parties to end this immediate crisis.
The African Union has now suspended Sudan due to the coup. The Sudanese military said the disagreements between the counterparts and a fear of relapse led the generals to take over the country. Many unions, including doctors, pharmacists and pilots, have announced a public strike. Protest continues in the Sudanese capital Khartoum and other states, condemning what they said an undermining of democracy. The Sudanese Professionals Association is calling on AU to put more pressure on the generals to hand over power. The association is an umbrella body of professional unions that backed the protest against the ousted leader Omar al-Bashir in 2019. It's also calling on all unions across Sudan to join the strike. The association has also made calls for a comprehensive civil disobedience if the power is not restored soon. The United Nations Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan has offered mediation to put generals and civilians on tables again. Naba Muhiddin, CGTN, Khartoum, Sudan.
As mentioned earlier, the international community has been pretty much united in its condemnation of the military's takeover of power in Sudan. Some quarters have either halted funding or have issued a warning on the same. Sudan had previously been hit by sanctions imposed in the country, mostly by the United States, during the rule of the ousted president Omar Hassan al-Bashir. Washington imposed some crippling sanctions on his regime for allegedly sheltering Islamic extremists, including the al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden, in the 90s. Mr. Bashir was eventually toppled by the military in April 2019 after waves of street protests. Activity is slowly resuming in parts of Khartoum, but residents are complaining there about a lack of supplies.
Movement is not the same as before. Today is the first day we're attending the market after the events, and the movement is not the same as before. The number of shoppers is fewer. It is not the same as before the events. Before then, the market movement was excellent, but when the recent events occurred, the movement of buying and selling decreased.
During my tour in Omdurman market, I noticed that some commodities have decreased in price. Sugar has become 20 pounds, yet it was previously 40 pounds. The situation has become very good.
All right then, so where exactly does Sudan go from here, specifically Sudan's military? Let's explore some options with Ali Verji. He's from the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg over in Sweden. He joins us now on the program. Ali, good to see you on the program. So some funding lines to Sudan being cut off, as we saw with the World Bank's suspension of program disbursements. But is this sufficient to get General al-Burhan to change course?
I doubt it is sufficient. These funding lines don't necessarily directly affect the military, which is well insulated from immediate economic pressure, controls a lot of the economy itself. And so it doesn't necessarily have enough to change course by itself. But it's an incremental action. There have been a number of actions, as we've been reporting, and so it contributes to that overall sense of dismay, which hopefully will change course.
But this is the same institution that essentially has been working under sanctions for a fairly long period of time. So arguably, they've basically learned to make do with, for lack of a better word, being cut off from most of the global economy, haven't they?
Well, exactly. The military, as I said, controls a large part of the Sudanese economy. And as you said, there's a lot of experience of dealing with this. At the same time, the economic situation overall in Sudan has been deteriorating, steadily so. And so it isn't necessarily that the military regime is entirely immune to the effects of what happens, but clearly they do have experience of dealing with these kinds of situations.
This is an interesting hypothetical, but is there a face-saving exit from this situation for General al-Burhan? Is one even possible?
I think it'd be very difficult for him to find a way to back down. He's clearly been thinking about doing this for some time, and taking the actions and taking the repressive actions that have unfolded over the last few days suggests that he's committed to his course of action. So I'm not sure he will back down personally. And we've seen in the past, not only after Bashir was toppled, but the first military government that tried to take power, the first general before Burhan, also faced a very similar situation, and he didn't last very long either. So I think Burhan is very much committed to the course of action he's taken, and probably won't find it so easy to back down.
So where then does this leave all the other key economic problems that the country had? Because they were working on getting a debt write-off from, I believe it was under the Highly Indebted Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, $56 billion of debt that they needed to essentially get through. This is all that work that had been done by Prime Minister Hamdok. That's essentially out the window now, isn't it?
I think it's on pause for the time being, probably not completely out the window, but certainly at danger of being so. The multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the IMF are not going to support a military government in Sudan. And so that kind of multilateral relief isn't going to happen. And it really makes Sudan turn towards countries that might be more amenable to supporting it financially, but those aren't necessarily part of these multilateral institutions in the same way.
Okay, then. So what about the regional picture that we're dealing with here? Because Sudan, what's happening in Sudan doesn't just affect the country. South Sudan, for example, its oil revenue essentially goes right through the country. Sudan was in the middle of negotiations with Egypt and Ethiopia about the GERD. Sudan's also being affected by the spillover from the conflict in northern Ethiopia, in Tigray province. Walk us through the regional implications here.
It certainly does have a number of regional implications. First, Sudan was chairing the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, this regional organization, which, although weak, is ostensibly responsible for addressing the regional crises that arise. Prime Minister Hamdok had tried to intervene to mediate a solution in Tigray. He didn't have much success in doing so, but clearly a military government in Sudan will have even less interest in finding a solution there. You mentioned the GERD. Sudan has been moving towards the Egyptian position for the last couple of years, and that's probably going to continue. But the real question is, will there be restraint when it comes to not only the GERD, but also the contested borderlands between Sudan and Ethiopia? And again, in the military-civilian government that was there just a few days ago, there was a tension between them on these kinds of issues, but there was also a balance. And so there was a degree of restraint being exercised. If the civilian element of the transitional government in Sudan is no longer there, then that same restraining function doesn't really exist anymore. And then with respect to other regional crises, whether that's in South Sudan or Somalia or indeed anywhere else, Sudan is a very big and important country. And if it is itself in crisis, then it clearly can't play a very effective role anywhere else.
Indeed. One last question for you. We started with the money question. Let's wrap up with that. If all these other funding lines are being chopped off, the World Bank saying, yeah, the $1.9 billion program we'd agreed on, that's essentially on pause. Debt relief, not essentially going to happen for a bit. What other countries might bankroll Sudan and why?
Well, this is the $1 million or perhaps the $1 billion question, and people are pointing to countries in the Gulf as being the likely patrons, whether Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. They have, of course, been rather discreet about any indication that they will come forward with lots of money, and I don't expect they would ever publicly, at least for the time being, make those kinds of announcements. But these are the countries that are rumored to be financially interested in supporting the military. Clearly, they do have interest in the region. Clearly, they have supported other military-led governments in the region as well. And in terms of their overall economic output, supporting Sudan is not particularly costly if you consider the other expenses that these countries have. So they can afford to do it. The question is, what do they want in return, and how far does that largesse continue, and what conditions does it come with?
Indeed, we'll see how this plays out. Ali Verji from the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Thank you very much. Time now for a run through some company headlines. All right then, company headlines. Let's start with Prudential. It's opened its Africa regional headquarters in the Kenyan capital. The life insurer moved its Africa regional headquarters from London to Nairobi to provide its businesses across the continent with greater, more closely provided support and to be closer to its customers, its partners and distributors on the continent as well. Samsung Electronics says it expects component shortages to affect chip demand from some customers in the current quarter after reporting its highest quarterly earnings in 3 years. The world's top maker of memory chips posted a 28% jump in operating profit in the July to September quarter to $13.48 billion on the back of an 82% year-on-year profit surge of its chip business, where earnings are up to $8.62 billion. Uber Technology says it's launching a new partnership with the rental car company Hertz to offer 50,000 Teslas as a rental option to its ride-hailing drivers by 2023. Uber drivers can now rent a Tesla through Hertz starting on the 1st of November in a couple of cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego and Washington, D.C. The program later this year will expand to other cities in the continental United States. And Land Rover has unveiled the new Range Rover, the 5th generation of this particular model, at the Royal Opera House in London. It promises more refinement, more customer choice, and a lot more scope for personalization. And it should deliver, at least the manufacturer hopes, new levels of emotional engagement than ever before. I can certainly tell you that the debates online have been very heated. The company plans to launch a purely electric Range Rover, the first of its sort, to join the lineup in 2024. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. Ethiopia risks suspension from the African Growth and Opportunity Act over the civil war in Tigray. And Uganda's capital plans to fine motorists who buy goods from hawkers in order to discourage street vending. We'll explore that when we return. There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN. See the difference. Welcome back. Ethiopia has invested billions of dollars in the past decade to position itself as a light manufacturing hub on the continent. Now, this key position is being threatened, however, if the nation is suspended from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, due to the ongoing conflict in Tigray. Textile and apparel made up roughly 90% of the goods exported duty-free into the US last year.
stitching shawls for export to the United States, pays Finotessalam's rent and her daughter's school fees. But now her job is in danger as the United States ponders whether to suspend Ethiopia's duty-free market status, citing abuses and a growing famine in northern Tigray region.
I'd be seriously affected if this factory is forced to close. I send my child to a private school, so I pay school fees and for the school bus. We live in a rented house, so we have to pay for rent too. If this company closes, I might be out of work for 4 to 5 months, just looking for a job, because I don't have the capital to start my own business. Therefore, I will be seriously impacted and my child might be forced to drop out of school.
A suspension threatens Ethiopia's aspirations to become a light manufacturing hub and hard-won economic gains.
We were able to create close to 200,000 direct jobs and millions of indirect jobs. So if AGWA is delisted, if there is a decision made to withdraw AGWA, it will have a direct impact on our effort to create more and better jobs for our citizens.
The act gives the sub-Saharan African nations duty-free access to the United States if they meet criteria including removing barriers to U.S. trade and making progress towards political pluralism.
AGOA, as you know, it's a privilege that's given to sub-Saharan African countries, and it's a great incentive when you know there is a discount of 15 to 20% that you can allow from your margin, and to make it reasonable for the customers that we are selling to in the U.S. And we've used AGOA for the past, since we started basically, 15 years ago. People that have worked with us since we started, 14 years, 15 years, 10 years. And that's, you've created a family. And that family is just gonna disappear.
Washington has repeatedly expressed concern over widespread reports of violence in Tigray.
It's very disappointing. I'm hoping that they won't take that kind of action. I don't think that action will bring any, it will bring results for them, but that's not a good result. And I don't think that Ethiopians here or in the diaspora will appreciate that.
Washington has already laid the ground for sanctions. The U.S. government chief trade representative said this month that Washington will make a decision soon on Ethiopia's status under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
On to Uganda now. The Kampala City Authority is considering an interesting policy. It's considering fining any motorists who encourage the habit of street vending by stopping their cars pretty much on the roads and buying goods on the streets. Local authorities say that street vending poses a health risk to residents, but also encourages tax evasion. CGTN's Hilary Ayasiga now reports.
They strategically position themselves on all corners of Kampala's streets, waiting for potential buyers. These are Kampala's street vendors. Stella Torach has been selling fruit for close to 2 years.
When they announced the outbreak of the coronavirus and then the lockdown, I had nowhere to go, so I decided to set up my business here.
Others say the benefit of street vending is in its accessibility.
It becomes very easy for most of our customers. Find accessibility very easy compared to when they are shopping in these supermarkets, in these markets which are in the city center.
But city authorities say exposing food to dust on the road is unhygienic. Most street vendors here deal in fresh fruits and vegetables. It's work carried out mostly by women and children, but city authorities say it is illegal. And plans are underway to force vendors off the streets.
We are in the final stages of coming up to remove vendors in Kampala. We have been talking to them. We do not want to do that. That is the last resort. So I urge all our friends, the vendors, please go to these markets. We have KCC officials who can actually get you spaces and you can make a living legally.
While vendors agree with the city proposals, they say there are limited stores in the markets to accommodate everyone. The changes could also come with strict regulations on motorists who buy goods on the street.
One of the things we are thinking about, although, is if there's a way we can even penalize the drivers in a way to stop them from encouraging vending, because you're encouraging an illegality.
But the buyers say purchasing goods on the street is convenient.
In the evening when we are from work, we're already tired. We are rushing at home to see what's at home. So this roadside is convenience for me.
Unemployment is still a big challenge in Uganda, with 2.44% of the country out of work. Local authorities say there are over 10,000 vendors on Kampala's streets. And as a way of restoring trade order in the capital Kampala, local authorities are now building new markets to make space for them. Hilara Isga, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Egypt's parliament has approved amendments to the Public-Private Partnership Law. These amendments are designed to allow the private sector to both plan and implement really large-scale infrastructure projects. It will also simplify procedures for the private sector to be awarded these large-scale contracts. Previously, only the government would implement these mega infrastructure projects. Here's Yasser Kim shedding light on the amendments and the impacts they're expected to have.
Amendments to the Public-Private Partnership Law is a major breakthrough for the private sector, which will share a chunk of the huge rewards of Egypt's massive rebuilding process. The Ministry of Planning had announced that $148 billion have been invested on infrastructure projects in the last 6 years and will be doubled in the next 6 years. And Parliament members who approved the bill believe private companies are ready to carry this huge financial burden with the state.
The state will save a lot of money as companies will incur the expenses too. In Egypt, we now have huge companies that can compete with international companies in construction, and they are all in the private sector and are well known. There are 5 or 6 huge companies that can take on these mega projects. There are also Arab companies that are willing to invest in these projects.
The amended law will cut red tape when bidding for any project. It will give companies the right to apply for and implement projects solely or in partnership with the state. Some projects will also be assigned directly to contractors without a bidding process. Abir Isam, who owns a group of construction companies, has backed the amendments.
The tenders before did not give an opportunity for the private sector to join in because of the stringent conditions and lack of transparency. So investors stayed away from the development process and only the state entities took the jobs. They didn't give much attention to the quality, only the price submitted in the bid. Good companies might offer higher prices, but better quality, and this was ignored. The new law allows acceptance of a higher bid if the quality is better.
Some officials claim many developers in Egypt have not been strong enough to take on huge infrastructure projects. But Isam disagrees.
Egyptian companies have the ability to implement big projects at high quality. We already do so in several African and Arab countries, the latest in Libya and Iraq. Nonetheless, some might resort to more experienced foreign companies to work together, so I expect partnerships with international companies with a good track record, such as Chinese companies.
Employment rates are expected to surge as well, because 80% of Egypt's workforce is in the private sector and a large portion in construction. Companies are expected to take on management of the newly installed railway system, build new roads, bridges and highways, construct energy and water treatment projects, in addition to the infrastructure for 24 new cities under construction, including the new administrative capital.
One thing is clear. If the private sector is capable of successfully delivering the mega infrastructure projects, it will open the door for huge investments in the sector and also benefit not only for the companies but for the economic growth as a whole. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
There's a high-level gathering designed to improve development prospects and outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa, especially after the pandemic. Our meeting is on in the Rwandan capital, Kigali. The meeting has been organized by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and is brought together the Intergovernmental Committee of Senior Officials and Experts. CGTN's Karim Chala is there.
The high-level United Nations Economic Commission for Africa meeting here in Kigali is themed Strengthening Resilience for a Strong Recovery and Attracting Investment to Foster Economic Diversification and Long-Term Growth in Eastern Africa.
Still, we were hopeful.
The UN said the COVID-19 pandemic has brought serious challenge to the region.
2020, the economy of East Africa shrunk for the first time in decades. The services and manufacturing sectors were hit hard by the pandemic, particularly revenues in tourism and travel-related industries. The agriculture sector was not spared, facing weather-related shocks and the biggest desert locust invasion in 70 years. The region has lost millions of jobs emerging from the conflict in the Horn of Africa, added to already heightened regional insecurity.
Before the pandemic, Eastern Africa was the fastest growing region on the continent. Countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda registering close to 10% economic growth. This meeting now wants a return to pre-pandemic levels of growth.
Various topics will be covered, including macroeconomic issues, investment opportunities and challenges in the region, trade and value chains, as well as peace and security as the key enabler for growth and sustainable development. Eastern Africa has been the fastest growing region in Africa before the pandemic, and we need to maintain the momentum.
Many say mass vaccination can save economies across the world from collapsing and even recover faster. Unfortunately, Africa so far has fully vaccinated only 5% of its population, and access to sufficient vaccines remains to be tricky. But according to the UNECA, there is light at the end of the tunnel.
The AU has also launched the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing to boost the manufacturing of vaccines on the continent. Rwanda was identified as a potential site, and the government has already established several partnerships to export world-class vaccine manufacturing supply chains for domestic use and continental export.
The world is now talking about economic recovery and how to accomplish that in no time. This United Nations 25th meeting of senior officials and experts wants to do just that for Africa. 14 nations, including Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Burundi, represented by their respective ministers and high officials, are attending this gathering. They are all already advised to work hand in hand for quick and real change to come. Grumtala CGTN, Kigali, Rwanda.
Time for a short break. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. Climate finance needs to rise sharply to at least $5 trillion a year globally by 2030 to fund measures to fight climate change. And we'll explore why avatars are growing in popularity as online influencers. The details coming up next.
Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time, Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Let's talk about the intersection of climate change and finance. Climate finance needs are forecast to rise sharply to about $5 trillion a year globally by 2030 in order to fund measures designed to fight climate change. Researchers from 5 green groups say that progress is lagging in pretty much all sectors, including transportation, agriculture, electricity. And they say that the world may not reduce emissions at the pace required to limit global warming to just 1.5 degrees Celsius in order to avoid its worst effects. None of the 40 indicators assessed in this study are in line with the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement goal of reining in the average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times. At the same time, the UN Conference on Trade and Development have published a report indicating that the annual costs of climate adaptation in developing countries could go as high as $300 billion in 2030. If mitigation targets are breached, those costs could rise to as much as $500 billion by 2050. All right, then let's explore this in a bit more detail. Richard Kozel-Wright is the Director of Globalization and Development Strategies Division at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Richard, thank you very much for your time this evening. When we talk about funding, though, I mean, we've heard past promises of funding over and over again, and these rarely ever have actually been materialized. Should policymakers be taking these promises that we're hearing now any seriously?
Yeah, good evening. Well, you're right. I mean, developing countries have grounds to be skeptical, and UNCTAD is an organization that established the 0.7% ODA target back in the early 1970s, and advanced economies have never reached that target in total. It's now just 0.3% of their gross national income. So, I mean, there's a history of skepticism that is justified. I guess there are some reasons to be a bit more hopeful in the current climate. Obviously, the pandemic has shown that that advanced economies have the ability to mobilize trillions of dollars when push comes to shove and they're facing their own particular crises. That's what's happened during the pandemic. And so I think we should take some hope from what's happened during the pandemic. There are some other things that are happening. Debt relief is back on the agenda, and debt relief has to be part of any financing strategy for developing countries. And there are signs that, you know, the initiatives like the HIPC initiative from the 1990s might be revived again. The IMF has launched a very large new issuance of what is called special drawing rights, essentially the money that the IMF creates. So $650 billion was created at the meeting last month, and so there are mechanisms out there, we think, that can be mobilized to meet the kinds of targets, and as you rightly say, the $100 billion that has been talked about in Glasgow is not sufficient, but there are mechanisms out there that can be mobilized, we think, to hit more ambitious financing targets going forward.
All right, let's work with what history has shown us, right, that the funding may not necessarily come. So looking at sub-Saharan Africa collectively, not many of these economies have long-term pools of savings available. But beyond those, what other domestic sources of capital can they deploy in order to essentially meet these climate investment targets? Can these countries do it by themselves?
It is, you know, history is not a great guide here, but it is the case that in many African countries, rates of capital formation, investment levels, were higher in the 1970s and 1980s, at least as a percent of their income, than they are today. So when, you know, if we're talking about raising the rate of capital formation of investment by 2 or 3 or 4 percentage points of GDP, we have some examples from history, from the region, that say that's possible. You know, governments need to raise more from taxes. There needs to be taxes on high wealth individuals. The Pandora Papers suggest that there is money there to be mobilized. Illicit financial flows have plagued African countries for decades, particularly illicit financial flows from large multinational corporations, and we need to rein that in to make sure that African economies have access to those resources. We, in the work that we do, we see a very positive role for development banks. The old mechanisms that were used back in the 60s and 70s to raise investment rates need to be revisited. There are strengths and weaknesses with those mechanisms. We know we need to take the good lessons from China, for example, where development banks have been critical to raising their investment rates, and learn from those and adapt them to the specific conditions of Africa. But there are certainly, I think, opportunities there. Local bond markets might provide another source of revenues. I mean, we would emphasize that the external constraint and the access to external financing is critical, but there are things that at the domestic level that governments can do to begin to mobilize domestic resources to raise their investment rates in both adaptation and mitigation efforts.
Indeed. Let's go to that, because back in May, UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Programme, they argued that we need at least $200 billion a year invested just to deal with forest restoration and agroforestry. Now, the ecological services provided by forests around the world, we've known this for a very long time, the benefits of the Amazon, the rainforest over in the Congo, but investing in them as an asset class is still deeply problematic. Is the problem here that, yes, we know what the problem is, we know what the solution is, but converting that solution into an investable asset, for lack of a better word, is proving to be difficult?
Yeah, I don't think the kind of returns that you can get from forest services are not the kind that asset managers are looking for in this kind of highly financialized, short-term financial market world. So I don't think you can rely on private capital to be able to make the kinds of investments in forests that you're talking about. The sad thing is that the public initiatives like the the reducing emissions through stopping deforestation and degradation of forests has not been effectively financed. That's certainly the case. And so, I mean, as you rightly say, forests could provide an important carbon sink and an opportunity to deal in part with the problem, but the financing certainly isn't there. But I wouldn't rely on private financing to fill that gap in that case, I have to say.
Indeed. One last question for you. Something else that at least finance managers do look at and say, okay, there's a return here. Coal, that's now becoming essentially a pariah asset class in some parts of international finance. Oil and gas arguably getting there as well. But gas is needed as a sort of transition fuel, right? As we essentially make this transition to getting away from coal, we need to have a bit more money flowing into LNG. How do we avoid making LNG a stranded asset, given this whole aversion to fossil fuels?
Well, I think the question of stranded assets needs to be put onto the negotiating agenda. It hasn't really been sufficiently talked about, and liquid natural gas is probably the lowest carbon intensive of the carbon fuels, but it's not a solution to the problem, obviously. I mean, the International Energy Authority, in its report that was released earlier this year in May, has basically argued if you want to kind of hit the targets that you mentioned earlier in the presentation, then we can't invest in carbon fuels. But that's realistically, we have to move in a systematic but sensible way. Maybe liquid natural gas can provide something of a bridge, but I think we need to have a serious discussion about stranded assets, and that's an issue for many African fuel producers. If we're going to make any progress in terms of finding a just transition for economies that have become heavily dependent on exporting fossil fuels. So I don't think LNG is not a solution to this problem in a long-term sense, but the issue of stranded assets has to be on the negotiating table.
Indeed. Let's see how this all plays out over in Glasgow. Richard Kozel-Wright, Director of Globalization and Development Strategies at UNTAD. Thank you. Now then, on to news just in. Facebook has rebranded. It's decided to change its name over to Meta. The firm's CEO and founder, Mark Zuckerberg, he made the announcement at the annual developer conference. He noted that this would be better at encompassing what the firm currently does. The company also revealed plans in a bit more detail for its metaverse, as it were, essentially a world of virtual and augmented reality where people can communicate, work and game in a virtual environment with headsets. Now, this name change, however, does follow a series of negative stories based on documents leaked by ex-employees. We'll certainly keep tabs on that and bring you the latest on it as it continues. Now, 3 days of virtual meetings of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, and its dialogue partners have wrapped up. Hosted by Brunei, the meetings also saw the participation of China's Premier Li Keqiang and the US President Joe Biden. As Ryan Meltzer now reports from Kuala Lumpur, much of the focus was predictably on recovering from the pandemic, but also key geopolitical issues.
Having sealed off their borders since early last year and endured repeated lockdowns, ASEAN economies have taken a battering. So much of the focus of the meetings was on economic recovery and better preparing for future emergencies. With ASEAN's key partners pledging vaccine doses, financial assistance and stronger cooperation. For the US, this was a comeback of sorts after the indifference of the Trump era.
You can expect to see the United States deepening our long-standing cooperation, pursuing new avenues of ministerial dialogue, investing in our countries and driving inclusive prosperity in this critical region.
The US's new AUKUS security pact with the UK and Australia proved contentious.
Hal kedua yang disampaikan oleh Presiden adalah
the Indonesian president conveyed concerns about AUKUS and the development of Australian nuclear-powered submarines that could spark high tensions and rivalry in the region.
AUKUS does not change Australia's deep, long-standing commitment to nuclear non-proliferation. Australia does not want and will not seek nuclear weapons, as I've assured all ASEAN.
The East Asia Summit, featuring the East Asian countries, the US and Russia, was a chance for countries often at loggerheads to find common ground, such as ensuring the speedy recovery from the pandemic. Premier Li Keqiang pledged that China will assist ASEAN to try to achieve one of its key goals of transitioning to Industry 4.0 and also pursuing more green and sustainable development. Missing out on all the goodwill toward ASEAN was Myanmar, with the country's military leader barred from taking part for ignoring its commitments to an ASEAN peace plan. Ryan Meltzer, CGTN, Kuala Lumpur.
Hundreds of Italian companies are ready to showcase their products at the 4th China International Import Expo in Shanghai. That event starts on the 5th of November. A family jewellery company that has taken part in this event from the start says the event provides a crucial opportunity to expand in a market of 1.4 billion people. Hermione Kitson travelled to Naples for a first-hand look.
From the Gulf of Naples in the seaside town of Torre di Greco, a family business has crafted its style through generations, transforming seashells into fine jewellery.
I'm here now with the owner of the company, Gino Di Luca. Please tell me, why is your brand unique?
Our brand is Cameo Italiano, and we do cameo jewelry. Our cameos are made out of seashells, so each one seashell is different, and we turn it into a jewelry of very high artistic and artisanal contents.
China is emerging as one of the company's biggest markets, with a potential of more than 60% of exports. In April this year, they opened a base in Shanghai and are currently preparing for the China International Import Expo.
The CII is for us the ideal platform where we go and showcase our very special products, and from there we can feel the energy and the vitality of the China market.
This year will be Cameo Italiano's 4th consecutive year at the event, which has been the key to its success there.
We are now concentrating on the products that we want to showcase at the upcoming CII Expo, and this is a special piece that we've been working at for almost 1 year.
It's one of hundreds of Italian brands hoping to export not just a product to China, but a culture and heritage.
It's a very intricate and delicate process. There's no room for mistake. There's no room for error. And it's a process also of interpretation.
They employ 40 master carvers, most of whom were born into the trade.
And this very layered story is catching the attention of all of our Chinese friends. And this is telling us how much potential we have with the China market.
These jewelers and the other Italian companies preparing for November's expo in Shanghai are hopeful that appreciation for products made in Italy will continue. Hermione Kitson, CGTN, Naples.
Virtual avatars, or virtual idols if you prefer, these are popular online influencers who are not actually human. They're artificially created entities. It's an idea that originated in Japan, but it's become increasingly popular in China as well. They can talk, they can sing, they can dance, they even appear on reality TV. And apparently they have a lot of real fans willing to support them, which is encouraging many companies to use them for promotions. CGTN's Ying Junyi has that story.
Hello, 宝宝们，大家好，欢迎收看这一期的上海早晨申小雅的。
The news anchor on the screen is not a real person, but a virtual host named Shen Xiaoya. Introduced by Shanghai Media Group last year, she's been pretty busy, hosting several programs and even conducting interviews. And with the support of an AR camera and a motion capture studio, she will also be able to report the upcoming International Import Expo, just like a real reporter.
工作1年以来呢，这个还是比较忙碌的工作。
I've been working for 1 year and it's been quite busy. I usually host TV news programs and live streams at some big events. For example, I'm preparing for the 4th CIIE now, and I also communicate with my fans online.
然后也会在那边和我的粉丝进行一些互动。
While Shen Xiaoya was not created to make money, most virtual idols have plenty of fans happy to spend money on them. First produced for anime, comics, and games, virtual idols are beloved by many of the young generation who show increasing interest in their work. And many companies and events organizers have now started paying attention to this niche marketing tool, as they want to build a connection with the highly digitalized younger generation. Virtual idol Xiao Xiayu made her first appearance 2 years ago, and now has 240,000 followers on video platform Bilibili. She says there are more companies deciding to work with virtual idols now.
那像我们最近和英伟达
For example, computer component maker NVIDIA is now working with us. And there are more entertainment programs now interested in our singing and dancing. Some producers have even created shows especially for us, and we have bigger audiences than before. They are not just comics fans. Many of them are interested in talking about real issues now. So what we do during our live streams is also changing.
还有一些歌曲的选择上面都会因为这样发生一些小小的改变。
Stephen Liu is one of the supporters of the virtual idols. He has purchased several derivative products based on virtual characters, saying they have a more real, if you can put it that way, emotional connection to their fans than human idols do.
Compared to real idols, the performers behind the virtual idols are performing based on their virtual models. Audiences don't know them in real life, so they can be more open and more willing to interact with their fans. And they can do more things with the virtual models than a real person could, producing more interesting content.
It's no coincidence that the rise of the virtual idols has come along with the increasing digital environment in which we live. 5G, virtual and augmented reality, computer imagery, with all these technologies, it's easier to make the virtual idols more lifelike and attractive. Where is all this going to end?
We are now talking about the concept of metaverse. It refers to a future iteration of the internet made up of 3D virtual spaces linked into a virtual universe. For example, the VR games now are based on the concept. And with the development of hardware and software, there are more marketing strategies based on it. Virtual idols are one of those things based on the metaverse concept. And in addition to the virtual idols, we also have virtual artworks now, and there will be more to come in the future.
现实中存在的东西，你在虚拟世界里面，在元宇宙里面都会找到一个复制品。
From concerts and fashion shows to live streaming and commercial activities, research from II Media says the virtual idol industry in China generated 3.5 billion yuan in total in 2020, with a 70.3% year-on-year growth. The market is expected to be worth 6 billion yuan this year, and that's in real money. Ying Jun, ICIS for CGTN, Shanghai.
All right, then a quick run through commodity prices. Brent crude, the price on that seems to have plateaued over the last couple of weeks, but that's really barely put a dent into its rally so far, even just in the second half of the year. Even at these prices, remember, it's gone up from around $44 a barrel all the way to $86. Coffee prices also up about 2.6% so far in October. It's been over $190 the entire time. You can partly thank bad weather in key markets like Brazil for that, among other factors. Coffee prices up around 50% so far in the year. Here's what's coming up next. We'll bring you the story of artists in Zimbabwe who are integrating plastic and metal waste into works of art.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Let's head over to Tunisia. The government over there is evaluating its national economic and social empowerment strategy for women and girls in rural parts of Tunisia. Under this plan, the Ministry of Family, Women, Children and Seniors rolled out a range of initiatives in agriculture, traditional industries and the processing of agricultural products.
Tunisian authorities say this program was launched to support the employment of women and young girls in rural areas by upgrading their skills through training. Tunisia also created several women development groups which provide more than 1,000 jobs.
We are evaluating the results of the National Strategy for Economic and Social Empowerment of Rural Women and Girls. This ambitious project started in 2017 and ends this year. The ministry supports any initiative which offers alternatives for women in areas characterized by a lack of economic opportunities and unemployment.
The International Labour Organization, ILO, is one of the main partners of the Tunisian government in the Women's Economic Empowerment Rural Development Project.
The project will continue because there are still challenges facing women and girls in rural environments like social protection, access to education, healthcare and transport. The second phase of this project will focus on finding concrete solutions to these problems.
Hajar Gafsi is a young entrepreneur who lives in a rural area. She has taken advantage of several financial and social support structures to launch her business, which created many jobs in her remote region. Hajar uses rose and flower petals to make jam.
Harvesting rose petals starts very early before sunrise to preserve the natural rose perfume from evaporation. Patience is required in this activity. It's a hard and challenging job, but I'm happy for being independent and creating added value in my rural region.
According to the Agriculture Department, many women entrepreneurs have launched successful businesses, including women development groups in rural areas. Authorities stress the need to enhance the role of rural women and girls who have shown responsibility and commitment during the COVID-19 crisis. Abdel Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
Solid waste, quite obviously, is a hazard to the environment. But artists in Zimbabwe are finding a way of integrating both plastic and metal waste into pieces of art that not only champion the ideals of a clean environment, but they also speak to the current themes of COVID-19 prevention and vaccination. CGTN's Beryl Oro has that story.
Where there's no proper household waste management system in place, people face the danger of having blocked waterways in their neighborhoods, which apart from being eyesores, can also become a breeding ground for diseases. Artists in Zimbabwe have, however, found a way of incorporating both plastic and metal waste into their art pieces. This in turn raises residents' awareness on the importance of keeping the environment clean.
I kind of follow what we use every day as consumer residue, the leftovers of everyday routine. So I follow these materials in different dumping sites. I look for materials which reflect people's lives. People from my periphery, like my studio here is in Mbare, which is a hotspot for reuse and repurposing of various materials in the whole country.
Zimbabwe's National Art Gallery believes that the role of art in spreading an eco-friendly theme is one that cannot be ignored, as artists can educate people on critical issues through their creative work.
Artists have found ways of using found objects. So that role on its own is important because it's upcycling, number one. Number two, it's also artists, they work as newsletters of the society. So whatever conceptualization ideas they put in these artworks are actually messages to the world, are messages to the community, are messages to all of us to be educated about a cleaner environment. This is a new beginning, it's a new birth, so it is up to us now to reinvent ourselves. For artists, it has been great because artists have always worked in isolation in their own studios. So I'm glad from what I'm seeing from my studio visits, it has been really good to see that artists have not given up their chisels, their brushes, and their ways of expressing themselves.
The exercise does not start and stop with the recycling of waste. Artists are also using their artwork to educate the masses on COVID-19 prevention and the need for vaccination. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
Quick update on the currencies as we wrap up the program. A focus on the Naira. It's gone as low as 422.17 to the dollar, at least in the formal interbank markets, depending clear what the parallel market rates are at the moment. It wasn't at those levels in today's session, but relatively close. 417.70 is a print we're interested in at the moment. The Kenyan shilling also continues its slow, steady depreciation against American dollar, down to 111.15 on the interbank market. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. Many ways to get your feedback back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.